A 12-year-old black boy saved a white girl's life, but his request in return made her father cry. Subscribe to the channel and write in the comments where you're watching us from. The summer heat clung to the cracked asphalt, rising in shimmering waves that blurred the horizon. The traffic light at the intersection flickered red, halting cars as their engines idled impatiently. Pedestrians hurried along the sidewalks, avoiding the oppressive sunlight by clinging to the narrow shadows cast by crumbling buildings. Among the crowd, a 12-year-old boy named Darius stood at the corner, balancing a wooden tray strapped around his neck. Plastic bottles filled with water and homemade lemonade rattled softly as he shifted from foot to foot, scanning the lanes of traffic. Darius's clothes hung loose on his slender frame, a faded t-shirt and shorts that had seen better days. His sneakers were scuffed, the soles threatening to peel away entirely. He wiped sweat from his brow with the back of his hand, the humidity making his dark skin glisten. The streets weren't kind to boys like him. They treated him as invisible until he stepped too close, at which point he became a nuisance, someone to be waved off or scolded for daring to exist in their space. He wasn't supposed to be out here. Not really. His grandmother had told him to stay home, to focus on school and leave the worries to the adults, but there were no adults left, just the two of them and her growing list of medications that drained what little money they had. That morning, Darius had woken up early. The apartment had felt even smaller than usual, the ceiling pressing down on him. The scent of bleach lingered from the night before, when he'd scrubbed the kitchen tiles to keep the bugs away. The one-bedroom unit barely held their belongings: a rusting refrigerator, a worn couch, and a bed where his grandmother rested most days. She had smiled when he'd brought her breakfast, the kind of smile that tried to hide the worry behind it. It hadn't fooled him. He had seen the way her hands trembled as she held the spoon, how she struggled to breathe after even the simplest movements. He had promised her he wouldn't be gone long, that he'd return before the afternoon heat became unbearable. But, standing there at the intersection, with his tray of drinks and dwindling patience, Darius felt the weight of time pressing down on him. Cars rolled to a stop as the light turned red again. Darius stepped forward, weaving through the lanes. He tapped gently on windows, his voice steady but soft. Water? Lemonade? Just $1. Most drivers ignored him, staring straight ahead or pretending to check their phones. Others waved him away with annoyed gestures. A few rolled down their windows just far enough to toss loose change into his hand before speeding off as if the transaction itself made them uncomfortable. "Thank you," Darius murmured each time, even when the coins barely made a dent in what he needed. The day dragged on, and his tray grew lighter. He counted the bills in his pocket during breaks, calculating how much more he'd need to buy the next round of medication. It was never enough. He paused beneath the shade of a streetlight, pressing the cool glass of a lemonade bottle against his forehead. Across the street, two men in suits walked briskly, their polished shoes clicking against the pavement. They didn't glance his way, neither did the woman in heels who passed by, clutching her purse closer as if he might try to grab it. He wasn't angry, not anymore. Anger had burned out a long time ago, leaving behind something quieter but heavier. The light turned red again. Darius stepped forward, tapping on the window of a luxury car. The driver, a woman with sunglasses perched high on her nose, didn't even look at him. Instead, she rolled up the window and turned up the music. Darius took a step back, his shoulders sinking. It wasn't the first time. It wouldn't be the last. Still, his eyes drifted toward the small plastic bag of pills sitting on the passenger seat of the car, so casually placed, so easily within reach for someone who could afford them without a second thought. Darius turned away and crossed back to the sidewalk. He couldn't afford to waste time. The sun had dipped lower by the time he decided to call it a day. The streets had begun to empty as people retreated to air-conditioned homes, leaving Darius to weave through the quieter alleys toward his apartment building. He moved quickly, clutching his earnings tightly. The closer he got to home, the more the tension in his chest eased. The neighborhood wasn't pretty. Peel-and paint, graffiti-covered walls, and broken fences, but it was familiar. It was his. He unlocked the door quietly, stepping into the dimly lit room. The air inside was stifling, but at least it offered a reprieve from the noise outside. His grandmother stirred in bed, her eyes fluttering open as he approached. "You're back," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I sold almost everything today," Darius replied, forcing cheerfulness into his tone. He knelt by the bed, taking her frail hand in his own. "We'll have enough for the medicine, I promise." She smiled, but he could see the exhaustion behind it. "You work too hard, baby. You're just a boy." "I'll be whatever I need to be," he said, squeezing her hand. He didn't tell her about the way people looked at him. He didn't tell her about the fear that gnawed at him every time he stepped onto the streets. She didn't need to know. That night, as Darius lay on the worn couch, he stared at the cracked ceiling and listened to the sound of his grandmother's breathing. It was too shallow, too uneven. He closed his eyes and made a silent promise to himself. Tomorrow he'd sell more. Tomorrow he'd make enough. He had to. The morning came too soon, pulling Darius back to the same corner, the same heat, the same desperate determination. And then it happened. It started with a flash of color, a girl's dress fluttering in the wind as she chased a ball into the street. The sound of tires screeching. The sharp intake of breath as Darius dropped his tray and ran. The moment stretched endlessly, each step pushing him closer to the girl, closer to the speeding car. The next thing he knew, she was on the ground, her wide eyes staring up at him in shock as the car skidded to a halt just inches away. Darius barely registered the crowd gathering or the murmurs of disbelief. He only knew that she was safe and that he had done what he needed to do. But as he turned to pick up the scattered bottles from his tray, he saw the black sedan pull up. And the man who stepped out of it would change everything. The honking of horns and screeching tires still echoed in Darius's ears as he crouched beside the girl, his breathing ragged. The crowd had started to gather, their murmurs blending into a dull roar that made his head pound. He glanced at her, pale, trembling but unharmed. Relief flooded through him, but it was quickly replaced by something colder. Fear. He could feel the eyes of the crowd on him. He knew what they saw. A skinny black boy in dirty clothes crouched beside a fragile white girl in an expensive dress. The narrative was already forming in their minds, even if they hadn't seen what happened. Darius forced himself to his feet and took a shaky step back. His tray of drinks lay scattered, bottles rolling across the asphalt. The girl, still clutching her ruined ball, looked up at him with wide blue eyes. She opened her mouth as if to speak, but the words didn't come. Before Darius could say anything, a black luxury sedan screeched to a halt nearby. The back door flew open, and a tall man in a tailored suit stepped out. His polished shoes hit the pavement with sharp precision, his posture radiating authority. He pushed past the bystanders without a word, his gaze locked on the girl. "Lila!" The girl flinched at the sound of her name, but her eyes lit up when she saw him. "Daddy!" She scrambled to her feet, her ruined dress streaked with dirt, and ran to him. The man scooped her up in one motion, his arms tightening protectively around her. For a moment, Darius felt a pang of something he couldn't name. Envy, maybe, or longing. But the man's eyes found him next, and any warmth vanished. "Who are you?" the man demanded, his voice sharp. Darius opened his mouth to explain, but the words caught in his throat. "What were you doing with my daughter?" the man snapped before Darius could respond. His voice rose, cutting through the noise of the crowd. "What did you do to her?" The accusations hit Darius like a slap. He shook his head, trying to step back, but the man closed the distance between them in 2 long strides. "He didn't do anything," Lila finally spoke, her voice small but clear. "He saved me, Daddy. I ran into the street, and he—" "Quiet." The man silenced her with a single word, his attention never leaving Darius. Darius took another step back, his heart pounding. He wanted to explain, to tell the man what really happened, but he could already see the disbelief in his eyes. "I should call the police," the man said, his voice low and dangerous. "What were you doing near my daughter?" The crowd stirred at the word police. Darius saw the looks people exchanged, some curious, others wary. No one stepped in. The man pulled out his phone. "No, wait." Darius finally found his voice, though it came out shakier than he'd hoped. I didn't do anything wrong. She was... Enough." The word snapped like a whip. The man's face hardened, his grip on his daughter tightening as if to shield her from Darius. Lila tried to speak again, tugging at her father's sleeve, but he ignored her. Darius's stomach twisted. He knew this wasn't going to end well. He'd seen it happen before. How quickly people assume the worst about boys like him. "I swear I didn't. Don't move." The man pointed at him, and Darius froze. The crowd began to shift, and Darius caught glimpses of their faces, some curious, others judgmental. A few looked sympathetic, but no one intervened. He felt the weight of their stares pressing down on him, making it hard to breathe. He wanted to run, but his legs wouldn't move. Lila started crying, her voice muffled against her father's shoulder. "Please, Daddy, he didn't hurt me. He saved me." The man hesitated, his phone still in his hand. He glanced down at his daughter, and something in his expression shifted. Doubt, maybe, or shame. But it was gone as quickly as it appeared. Darius took the opportunity to step back again, his hands trembling. "I just wanted to help," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. The man didn't respond. Instead, he turned and carried Lila back to the car. She looked over his shoulder, her tear-streaked face filled with something Darius couldn't quite place. Guilt, maybe, or helplessness. The car door slammed shut, and the sedan pulled away, leaving Darius standing in the middle of the street. The crowd began to disperse, their interest fading now that the spectacle was over. A few people lingered, throwing glances his way, but none of them spoke to him. Darius bent down and started gathering the bottles from his tray. Most of them were cracked or leaking, their contents pooling on the pavement. His hands shook as he worked, his breath coming in shallow gasps. He didn't cry. He wanted to, but he didn't. By the time he finished cleaning up, the sun had started to set, casting long shadows across the street. He stuffed the remaining bottles into his tray and walked away without looking back. When he reached his apartment, the door creaked as he stepped inside. His grandmother was still in bed, her breathing shallow but steady. "You're late," she murmured, her eyes half open. "Sorry," Darius said, setting the tray down. I had to stay a little longer." She didn't press him for details. Instead, she reached out and squeezed his hand. "You're a good boy," she said softly. "You always do the right thing." Darius bit the inside of his cheek and nodded, but as he lay awake that night, staring at the cracked ceiling, the man's words echoed in his mind. "What were you doing near my daughter?" The accusation burned, sinking into his chest and refusing to leave. He hadn't done anything wrong. He knew that. But it didn't matter. Because to men like that, to men with power and money, someone like Darius was always guilty until proven innocent. Tomorrow, he told himself, tomorrow he'd sell more drinks. Tomorrow he'd make enough money to get the medicine his grandmother needed. But he also knew, deep down, that tomorrow wouldn't erase what had happened today. Darius didn't sleep much that night. The cracked ceiling of his apartment seemed to press down on him, the shadows cast by passing headlights creeping like dark fingers across the walls. He turned over, trying to find a comfortable position on the worn-out couch, but his body refused to relax. His mind kept replaying the scene from earlier. Lila's frightened face, the screech of tires, and most of all the sharp accusations from her father. He couldn't shake the weight of it. The way the man had looked at him as though he were nothing more than a threat made Darius feel small in a way he hadn't felt in years. It didn't matter that he had saved the girl's life. In that moment, to everyone watching, he had been exactly what they expected, a boy from the streets, dangerous and untrustworthy. When dawn finally came, Darius was already awake. He moved quietly, careful not to disturb his grandmother as he prepared a simple breakfast of oatmeal and tea. Her health had been declining faster lately, and every time he looked at her frail figure, he felt the urgency pressing harder against his chest. He couldn't afford to waste time dwelling on what had happened. By the time the morning rush began, Darius was back at his usual spot on the corner, his tray of drinks strapped around his neck. But something felt different. The cars passing by seemed louder, the drivers' gazes harsher. He tried to focus, to block it all out and keep working, but the knot in his stomach wouldn't go away. It didn't take long for the first sign of trouble to appear. A sleek black car rolled up to the light, its tinted windows reflecting the harsh sunlight. Darius recognized it immediately. The same car from yesterday. The window rolled down and the man, Lila's father, leaned out. His expression was unreadable, but there was something colder in his eyes this time, something heavier. Darius's heart sank. "You," the man said, his voice cutting through the noise of traffic. Darius froze, his hands gripping the edges of his tray. "What are you doing here?" The question hung in the air, sharp and accusing. Darius swallowed, trying to steady his breathing. "I'm just selling drinks." The man cut him off, his tone dripping with disdain. "Is that what you're calling it?" Darius flinched but didn't look away. He knew better than to show weakness. "I'm not doing anything wrong," he said quietly. The man stepped out of the car and Darius instinctively took a step back. The crowd at the intersection began to notice, heads turning toward the confrontation. "You expect me to believe that?" the man said, closing the distance between them. "Yesterday, I find you with my daughter, dirty, grabbing at her, and now you're standing here like nothing happened?" "I wasn't grabbing her," Darius protested, his voice rising despite himself. "I saved her. She—" "Enough." The word struck like a whip, sharp and final. Darius's words caught in his throat. "You're a liar," the man said, his voice low but loud enough for the onlookers to hear. "You think I don't know your kind? Hanging around busy streets, looking for an easy target. You're lucky I didn't call the cops yesterday." The crowd murmured. Darius felt his cheeks burn, but he forced himself to stand tall. "That's not what happened," he said, his voice trembling despite his efforts. But the man wasn't listening. He turned to the crowd, raising his voice. Did anyone here see what happened yesterday? Did anyone see this boy grab my daughter?" The murmurs grew louder, and Darius's chest tightened. No one stepped forward to defend him. No one said a word. And then Lila appeared. She stepped out of the car, her face pale but determined. "Daddy, stop," she said, tugging at his sleeve. The man ignored her. "Go back to the car, Lila." "No." Her voice cracked, but she didn't back down. "You're wrong. He didn't do anything bad. He saved me." Her words hung in the air, but they didn't seem to make an impact. The man's jaw tightened, and he turned back to Darius. "You stay away from my family," he said, pointing a finger at him. "I don't care what your story is. If I see you near her again, I'll make sure the police handle it." Darius wanted to speak, to defend himself, but the words wouldn't come. His eyes darted to Lila, who looked like she might cry, and then to the crowd, which was already beginning to lose interest now that the confrontation was winding down. The man turned and guided Lila back to the car. She looked back at Darius one last time, her expression a mix of guilt and helplessness, before the door shut and the car sped off. Darius stood there for a long time after they left. He could still feel the eyes of the crowd even after they had dispersed. Some of them had lingered, throwing curious or pitying glances his way, but no one had spoken to him. No one had asked for his side of the story. He bent down and began gathering his bottles. Most of them had been knocked over, a few cracked and leaking. His hands shook as he worked, his breath coming in shallow gasps. By the time he finished, the knot in his stomach had hardened into something heavier. When he returned home that night, his grandmother was awake, sitting up slightly and smiling when she saw him. "You're late again," she said softly. "I sold almost everything," he lied, forcing a smile. She patted his hand. "You're such a good boy." The words felt like an anchor, pulling him back to reality. He sat by her side for the rest of the evening, helping her eat and making sure she took her medicine. But even as they talked about ordinary things, the weather, the neighbor's barking dog, his thoughts kept drifting back to the intersection. He replayed the scene over and over, trying to figure out what he could have done differently. But no matter how many times he turned it over in his mind, he kept coming back to the same conclusion. It wouldn't have mattered. To that man, to everyone watching, he had already been guilty before he even opened his mouth. Later that night, as he lay awake on the couch, Darius stared at the ceiling and tried to shake the memory of the man's voice. "You stay away from my family." It wasn't fair. He had done the right thing. He had saved her. But in the eyes of the world, that didn't matter. And as the night stretched on, Darius made a silent promise to himself. He wasn't going to let this break him. Not now. Not ever. The morning light crept through the curtains of the kingly estate, casting long shadows across the polished marble floors and high vaulted ceilings. The grandeur of the mansion stood in stark contrast to the cramped apartment where Darius spent his restless night. Yet, despite the luxury surrounding him, Walter Kingley sat at the edge of his king-sized bed, his elbows resting on his knees and his hands clasped tightly together. The events of the previous day lingered in his mind, refusing to dissipate no matter how many times he tried to push them aside. He had barely touched his breakfast and ignored several calls from his assistant, something highly unusual for a man whose life revolved around tight schedules and constant business negotiations. Walter had always prided himself on his ability to read people. Years of building his empire had honed his instincts, teaching him how to spot liars, manipulators, and threats before they could get close enough to do any harm. So why did he feel like he had made a mistake? He replayed the scene over and over, The skinny boy, the shattered bottles, the fear in his eyes. And then Lila's words echoed in his mind, sharp and cutting. "He saved me." Her voice had been desperate, almost pleading, but Walter had dismissed it in the heat of the moment. He hadn't listened. Instead, he had let his instincts guide him, and now he wasn't sure if those instincts had betrayed him. Walter stood and walked to the window, staring out at the perfectly manicured lawn below. His reflection in the glass looked older than he remembered, the lines on his face more pronounced. He knew he needed to get back to work. Contracts needed signing, meetings needed attending. But instead, he reached for the remote and turned on the television. The local news channel flickered to life, and his stomach dropped when he saw the headline, "Local boy saves child from traffic accident. Labeled a threat instead." The screen cut to footage from a nearby surveillance camera. Walter watched in silence as the grainy video showed the boy, Darius, dropping his tray and running toward Lila, pushing her out of the way just in time. The car skidded to a stop, and then Walter himself appeared in the frame, stepping out of his car and confronting the boy. He couldn't bear to watch the rest. He turned off the television and sat back down, running his hands through his hair. How had it come to this? Walter prided himself on being fair, on making decisions based on logic and facts. Yet, here he was, the villain in a story that was spreading faster than wildfire. Social media had already latched onto the narrative, and comments poured in, some defending him, others condemning his actions as racist and classist. And the worst part? He wasn't sure they were wrong. Walter's thoughts were interrupted by a soft knock on the door. Lila peeked inside, her eyes puffy from crying the night before. "Daddy?" Walter forced a smile and motioned for her to come in. She climbed onto the bed beside him, curling her legs beneath her. "I'm sorry," she said quietly. Walter blinked. "For what?" "For yelling at you. And for what happened with that boy." He swallowed hard, guilt twisting in his chest. "You don't have to apologize, sweetheart. I should be the one saying sorry." Lila looked up at him with wide eyes. "Then why don't you?" Her question cut deeper than he expected. Walter had always taught his daughter to take responsibility for her actions, to own up to her mistakes. Yet here he was, hesitating. Because apologizing would mean more than just admitting fault. It would mean facing the truth about himself, the biases he had tried to ignore, the assumptions he had made without evidence. It would mean changing. "I'll fix this," he promised, though he wasn't entirely sure how. Lila nodded and rested her head against his arm. "I liked him," she said softly. "He was nice." Walter felt the weight of her words settle over him. Later that day, after dropping Lila off at school, Walter instructed his driver to take him to the intersection where it all happened. He wasn't sure what he expected to find, but as the car slowed near the corner, his stomach knotted. Darius was there, just as before, standing with his tray of drinks, but there was something different about him now, a heaviness in his posture, a guarded look in his eyes as he approached cars. Walter watched for a moment before stepping out of the vehicle. He didn't miss the way Darius stiffened when he saw him, his hands tightening around the straps of his tray. Walter approached slowly, feeling the eyes of nearby pedestrians on him. "I need to talk to you," he said, his voice softer than it had been the day before. Darius didn't move. He looked wary, as if expecting another confrontation. "I saw the news," Walter continued, "and I saw the video. He paused, the words catching in his throat. "I was wrong." Darius's eyes narrowed. "About what?" "About you." Walter exhaled, forcing himself to hold the boy's gaze. "I let fear and anger cloud my judgment, and I accused you of something you didn't do. I'm sorry." The apology hung in the air, but Darius didn't react the way Walter expected. He didn't relax or look relieved. Instead, he folded his arms and tilted his head. "Why are you really here?" The question caught Walter off guard. He opened his mouth to answer, but stopped when he saw the doubt in the boy's eyes. Because it wasn't enough. Words weren't enough. Walter reached into his pocket and pulled out a thick envelope, holding it out to Darius. "Take this. It's for you and your family. For what you did." Darius looked at the envelope, but didn't take it. "I don't want your money," he said flatly. Walter blinked. "What?" "I don't want money." Darius's voice grew steadier. "I want something real." Walter frowned. "What does that mean?" Darius hesitated before answering. "I want you to help people like me. People who can't afford doctors or medicine. My grandma needs help, and so do a lot of other people in my neighborhood. If you really want to fix this, build something that matters." Walter stared at him, stunned by the boy's boldness. But beneath the surprise, something else stirred. Respect. This wasn't what he had expected, but maybe it was what he needed. "Okay," Walter said after a long pause. "Let's do it." Darius looked at him skeptically, but Walter extended his hand. "I mean it," he said. "We'll start with your grandmother, and then we'll keep going." For the first time, Darius's expression softened, but he didn't shake Walter's hand. Not yet. Instead, he nodded. "We'll see." As Walter returned to his car, he felt something shift inside him. He didn't know if he could undo the damage he had caused, but for the first time in years he felt like he was moving in the right direction. And for Darius, it was the first spark of hope that things might finally change. Walter Kingley sat in his office, his fingers drumming nervously against the polished mahogany desk. The papers stacked neatly in front of him, a proposal for the clinic, financial projections, and legal drafts, felt heavier than any deal he had ever negotiated. The room, with its panoramic windows overlooking the city skyline, suddenly seemed too large, too cold. The encounter with Darius had left him unsettled. The boy's refusal of the envelope still echoed in his mind. Walter had expected gratitude, even relief. Instead, Darius had challenged him. The memory of the boy's steady gaze, calm, unyielding, refused to fade. "I don't want your money. I want something real." Walter had spent his life fixing problems with money. When deals went south, he bought his way out. When scandals loomed, he paid for silence. But this wasn't a problem he could throw cash at and forget. He leaned back in his chair, staring at the ceiling. Lila's words lingered too, as sharp as ever. "Then why don't you say sorry?" He had said it. He had faced Darius and apologized, but it hadn't been enough. The phone buzzed, pulling him from his thoughts. "Yes?" "Sir?" His assistant's voice came through the speaker, clipped and professional. "I've scheduled your meeting with the city officials about the clinic project. They're hesitant, but I think they'll come around once they see the funding proposal." Walter hesitated. "Keep pushing it through," he said, "and make sure the press doesn't hear about this until it's finalized." "Understood." He ended the call and rose from his chair. The floor-to-ceiling windows reflected his image, a man used to being in control, but today his reflection looked uncertain. Darius sat beside his grandmother's bed, watching her labored breathing. The room was dim, the only light coming from the small lamp on the nightstand. Her frail hand rested in his, her fingers barely able to curl around his palm. "You're so quiet tonight," she murmured, her voice raspy. "I'm just tired," Darius lied. In truth, his mind hadn't stopped racing since the encounter with Walter. The man's apology had sounded genuine, but Darius couldn't forget the way he had been treated, how quickly he'd been judged, how easily the accusations had fallen from Walter's lips. But the offer to help his grandmother and others in the community, that had been unexpected. Darius didn't know whether to believe it. "Are you still thinking about that man?" his grandmother asked, her eyes searching his face. Darius hesitated before nodding. "You don't trust him?" "No," Darius admitted. "I don't." His grandmother squeezed his hand as tightly as she could manage. "Sometimes people need time to change," she said softly. "Don't shut the door on someone who's trying." Darius looked away, guilt twisting in his stomach. She always believed the best in people, even when they didn't deserve it. "I'll be back," he said, gently pulling his hand free. "I need to take care of something." When Darius arrived at the kingly estate, he felt out of place before he even stepped through the gates. The sprawling mansion, with its pristine lawn and towering columns, looked like something out of another world. He lingered near the entrance, unsure whether to ring the bell or walk away. But before he could decide, the door opened and Walter stepped out. Their eyes met, and for a moment neither spoke. "You came back," Walter said finally. Darius nodded. "I need to know if you're serious." "About what?" "The clinic," Darius said, "and about helping my grandmother." Walter gestured for him to come inside, but Darius hesitated. "I'll explain everything," Walter said, "but only if you give me the chance." Darius followed him into the house, his steps slow and deliberate. The interior was even more extravagant than he had imagined. Chandeliers, marble floors, and walls lined with artwork. But instead of being impressed, Darius felt the weight of it all, a reminder of just how different their worlds were. Walter led him to the study where papers were spread across the desk. "I started working on this the day we talked," Walter said, motioning to the documents. "Funding plans, construction blueprints, timelines, everything we need to make the clinic happen." Darius stared at the papers, his pulse quickening. It looked real, more real than he had expected. "I don't want it to just be a building," Darius said finally. "I want it to be a place people can trust. No bills they can't pay. No paperwork that scares them away." Walter nodded. "That's the plan." Darius didn't speak for a long time. When he finally looked up, his expression was unreadable. "If you mess this up, if you use it to make yourself look good and then forget about it, I won't let you get away with it." Walter's mouth twitched, almost forming a smile. "Deal." The days that followed were a blur of activity. Walter threw himself into the project, calling in favors, negotiating permits, and cutting through red tape. At the same time, he began visiting the neighborhood where Darius lived, talking to residents and learning about their struggles. But not everyone was on board. Walter's business partners voiced their concerns, warning him that associating with charity cases would damage his reputation. "This isn't your problem to fix," one of them said during a heated meeting. "It is now," Walter replied. He wasn't sure when the shift had happened, when Darius's challenge had stopped feeling like an obligation and started feeling like a mission. Darius, meanwhile, balanced school, work, and caring for his grandmother. He visited the clinic site regularly, keeping an eye on the progress. But doubt lingered. He still wasn't sure whether Walter's motives were genuine, or if this was just a way to save face. Then, one evening, Walter showed up at their apartment. "I have something for you," he said, holding out an envelope. Darius hesitated. "I told you I didn't want money." "It's not money." Inside was an appointment card for a specialist, someone who could treat his grandmother. Darius's throat tightened. "Thank you," he said softly. Walter nodded. "I owed you that much." By the time the clinic began to take shape, both Darius and Walter had changed. Walter no longer saw the neighborhood as a place to avoid, and Darius no longer saw Walter as just another rich man out of touch with reality. But there was still work to do. The clinic wasn't just a building. It was a promise, and both of them knew that promises had to be kept. Walter Kingley stood in the unfinished shell of the clinic, his polished shoes crunching against the loose gravel scattered across the dusty concrete floor. Sunlight streamed through the skeletal framework, illuminating the beams and exposed wires that would soon form the ceiling. The faint hum of drills and saws echoed through the space as workers moved around him, their focus split between measuring beams and hauling materials. Despite the noise and activity, Walter's thoughts were consumed by the conversation he'd had with Darius the night before. "If you mess this up," the boy had said, "I won't let you get away with it." Those words rang in Walter's head, sharp and unwavering, as if the boy's voice was carved into the very foundation of the building. It wasn't a threat, it was a promise. Darius wasn't going to let this project fail, and neither would Walter. But promises and good intentions didn't guarantee success. Walter knew that better than anyone. The resistance had started almost immediately after he'd announced the clinic project. At first, it was quiet. Pointed questions during board meetings, raised eyebrows, and murmured comments about how this wasn't the kind of investment they expected from him. But as the plans solidified and the budget expanded, the opposition grew louder. "This is reckless," one of his top executives had said during a tense meeting. "Pouring millions into a free clinic in one of the worst parts of the city? What kind of return do you expect on this?" "It's not about returns," Walter had replied, keeping his voice even. His response was met with scoffs and skeptical glances. "Then what is it about?" another board member demanded. "Your reputation took a hit after that incident with the boy, and now you're trying to clean it up with charity work. Is that it?" Walter had felt his temper flare, but he kept it in check. "I'm doing this because it's the right thing to do," he said firmly. But the objections didn't stop. Investors threatened to pull out of his other ventures, claiming they couldn't trust his priorities. Some even accused him of alienating his core clientele by associating his name with a low-income neighborhood. Walter refused to back down. He'd built his empire from the ground up, navigating ruthless competition and political games. He wasn't going to let this clinic fall apart because of greed and short-sightedness. Yet, as he left those meetings and returned to the site, doubts gnawed at him. He knew the stakes were higher than just his reputation or financial losses. If he failed, it wouldn't just be his defeat. It would be Darius's, too, and the boy couldn't afford another disappointment. Darius watched the construction site from across the street, his arms crossed and his shoulders tense. The building was finally starting to take shape, but his excitement was overshadowed by the growing rumors in the neighborhood. Word had spread that the clinic might not happen. People whispered that it was just another rich man's publicity stunt, that the moment things got tough, Walter Kingley would walk away. Darius couldn't blame them for doubting. He had doubts himself. He'd been spending more time at the site lately, watching every delivery, talking to workers, and checking the plans whenever he could. He wasn't sure what he was looking for. Maybe signs that things were falling apart, or maybe proof that it was real. But the longer he stood there, the heavier the responsibility felt. This wasn't just about his grandmother anymore. People in the neighborhood had started approaching him, asking questions about the clinic and whether they'd be able to afford treatment. Mothers worried about their kids. Older men and women talked about the years they'd avoided doctors because they couldn't pay the bills. Darius knew that if the clinic failed, they'd lose more than just hope. And so would he. Walter sat across from the mayor in a private meeting room at City Hall, the tension palpable. "I'm asking for approval, not charity," Walter said, pushing the proposal across the table. The mayor raised an eyebrow. "And I'm asking for reassurance. How do I know this isn't a vanity project? Something you'll abandon the moment it becomes inconvenient?" Walter leaned forward. "Because I've already put too much into this to let it fail." The mayor studied him for a long moment before sighing. "You've got powerful enemies, Kingley. They don't want this clinic to succeed. You need to be ready for that." Walter's jaw tightened. "I already am." Back at the site, Darius noticed the first signs of sabotage a few days later. Pallets of materials were missing, deliveries were delayed, and rumors began circulating that the permits might be revoked. Workers started to quit, citing threats and intimidation. Darius felt panic rising. He rushed to Walter's office, barging in without knocking. "They're trying to stop it," he said, his voice shaking. "The clinic. Someone's messing with it." Walter was already on the phone, barking orders to his legal team. He looked up at Darius and nodded grimly. "I know. Then do something." "I'm doing something," Walter snapped, then caught himself. He took a breath. "This is bigger than you think, Darius. There are people who don't want this clinic built because it threatens the system they benefit from." "I don't care how big it is," Darius shot back. "You promised." Walter stared at him, then nodded. "I won't let them stop this. I promise." The days that followed were chaotic. Walter doubled security at the site, hired a new crew, and pushed the city officials to expedite permits. He appeared at community meetings, addressing concerns and dispelling rumors. Darius was there through it all, refusing to back down. He rallied the neighborhood, convincing them to keep supporting the project even when it looked like it might fall apart. For the first time, Walter saw the boy not as someone he was helping, but as someone leading a fight he hadn't even realized he was part of. The turning point came when Walter held a press conference at the construction site. Flanked by local activists and community leaders, he announced his full commitment to the clinic, detailing the resources he'd secured and the partnerships he'd formed. Darius stood beside him, and for the first time, Walter felt like they were equals. Not a billionaire and a street kid, but two people working toward the same goal. By the end of the conference, the tide began to turn. Public support grew louder, drowning out the opposition. Donations poured in, and volunteers offered to help once the clinic opened. But as Walter looked at Darius, he knew the real work had only just begun. That night, Darius returned home to find his grandmother sitting up in bed, her face brighter than it had been in weeks. "You did it," she said softly. "Not yet," Darius replied, sitting beside her, "but we're getting there." For the first time in a long time, he believed it. The clinic was no longer just an idea. Its skeleton had grown into walls and windows, its foundation strengthened by sweat, persistence, and quiet defiance. From the outside, it looked almost complete. Glass doors installed, paint fresh on the exterior, and a bold sign declaring its name: Hope Health Center. But for Walter Kingley and Darius, the fight was far from over. Walter stood near the entrance, his arms crossed as he watched the construction workers load the last pieces of medical equipment inside. His tailored suit was speckled with dust, and his polished shoes bore scuff marks from weeks of site visits. It was a look he never imagined wearing, but it no longer felt foreign. He turned to Darius, who stood beside him, hands shoved into the pockets of his worn-out jeans. The boy had become a permanent fixture at the site, keeping a sharp eye on every step of the process. Walter admired his focus, though he also saw the exhaustion etched into his features. "You ready for this?" Walter asked, breaking the silence. Darius shrugged. "I don't think it matters if I'm ready. It just has to work." Walter nodded. He understood that feeling all too well. Despite the visible progress, problems kept piling up. The clinic's opening date had been delayed twice already, first due to electrical issues, then because of missing permits that city officials swore had been filed but were mysteriously lost. Walter suspected sabotage, though proving it was nearly impossible. Meanwhile, investors continued to distance themselves from Walter's other projects. One by one, they pulled out of deals, citing concerns about his unpredictable behavior. The media spun it into a narrative of a wealthy businessman losing his grip, further fueling doubts. At the same time, the neighborhood's trust remained fragile. Some residents embraced the clinic, grateful for the promise of affordable health care, but others stayed skeptical. "What's he really getting out of this?" people asked. "He's a billionaire. They don't do charity." Darius heard the whispers, and each one felt like a slap. He had put everything he had into making people believe, but old wounds ran deep. Generations of broken promises weren't erased overnight. Even his grandmother, though supportive, had her doubts. "He seems sincere," she said one evening as they sat at the dinner table. "But people like him. They don't live in our world, Darius. They don't see what we see." Darius didn't argue. Instead, he doubled down, spending even more time at the site and pushing Walter to stay true to his word. Walter, for his part, found himself changing in ways he hadn't anticipated. The more time he spent in the neighborhood, the more he saw the cracks, the broken-down schools, the abandoned houses, the grocery stores with half-empty shelves. He began to realize just how blind he had been. He wasn't used to feeling powerless, but there were moments when the scale of the problem overwhelmed him. Building one clinic suddenly felt like dropping a bucket of water into a forest fire. Yet every time he started to doubt himself, he thought of Darius, how the boy had refused to back down, even when the odds were stacked against him. That determination was contagious. Walter started spending more time at the site, talking to residents, asking questions, and listening in a way he never had before. He learned their names, their struggles, and their fears. He met parents who had lost children to preventable illnesses, elderly residents who rationed medications to make ends meet, and teenagers forced to drop out of school to support their families. It changed him. One afternoon, as Walter was leaving the site, he noticed an elderly woman struggling to carry a bag of groceries. Without thinking, he crossed the street and offered to help. She hesitated at first, eyeing his expensive suit, but eventually handed him the bag. "Thank you," she said softly. Walter smiled. "No problem." It was a small moment, but it stayed with him. Darius noticed the change, too. Walter was no longer just the man in the suit who had accused him of being a thief. He was showing up, day after day, even when it wasn't easy. But Darius wasn't ready to let his guard down completely. One evening, as they reviewed the clinic's final inspection reports, Darius turned to Walter. "Why are you really doing this?" Walter looked up, surprised by the question. "I told you," he said, "because it's the right thing to do." Darius shook his head. That's not enough. Walter leaned back in his chair, considering his answer. Because I was wrong about you, he said finally, and because I don't want to be that man anymore. For the first time, Darius believed him. The final push to open the clinic was a battle against time. The electrical issues were resolved, the missing permits refiled and approved, and the staff, nurses, doctors, and volunteers began their training. The walls were painted, the exam rooms furnished, and the waiting area stocked with chairs and magazines. But just when it seemed like everything was falling into place, Walter received a call that nearly derailed it all. "We found irregularities in your finances," the voice on the phone said. "We're launching an audit." Walter hung up, his hands trembling. It was retaliation. He knew it, but there was no way to stop it without making things worse. Darius found him later that night, sitting in the darkened clinic. "What's wrong?" Walter hesitated before explaining. "They're trying to shut me down," he said. Darius didn't flinch. "Then don't let them." Walter looked at the boy, this kid who had risked everything for his grandmother, who had refused to give up no matter how many times the world knocked him down. And he felt something shift inside him. "No," he said, "I won't." The grand opening of the clinic finally arrived. The ribbon-cutting ceremony drew a crowd. Residents, reporters, and city officials all gathered outside. Walter gave a speech about hope and responsibility. But the loudest applause came when he stepped aside and motioned for Darius to join him. "This clinic exists because of him," Walter said, his voice steady, "because he reminded me what it means to fight for something that matters." Darius froze, caught off guard by the spotlight, but then he stepped forward. "I just wanted my grandma to get better," he said, his voice quiet but clear. "And I wanted other people to get that chance too." The crowd erupted in cheers, and for the first time Darius let himself feel proud. That night, as Walter locked up the clinic, he turned to Darius. "You did good today," he said. Darius smirked. "You didn't do too bad yourself." Walter laughed, and for the first time in weeks, the weight on his shoulders felt lighter. But they both knew this was just the beginning. The real work was only starting. The sun dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows across the clinic's parking lot. The grand opening was over, but the echoes of applause and cheers lingered in Walter Kingley's mind. The day had been a triumph, at least on the surface. Smiling faces, handshakes, and newspaper flashes captured a narrative of success. Yet, as Walter stood in the now quiet lobby, gazing at the polished floors and freshly painted walls, he knew the real work was just beginning. Darius sat cross-legged on one of the waiting room chairs, flipping through a worn notebook. He had started carrying it everywhere, jotting down ideas, questions, and reminders about the clinic. Walter had come to admire the boy's focus, even as it occasionally reminded him of how much Darius had given up just to keep this dream alive. Walter's footsteps echoed as he crossed the room and sat down next to him. "You should go home," Walter said. "Get some rest." Darius didn't look up. "Not yet." Walter sighed but didn't push. Instead, he let his gaze wander around the room. The clinic felt alive already. Nurses restocking shelves, doctors preparing schedules, and volunteers cleaning up after the day's festivities. It was a good start, but only a start. "You did it," Walter said finally, breaking the silence. Darius closed the notebook and met his gaze. "We did it." Walter smiled faintly. "Yeah, we did." For the next few weeks, the clinic became the center of their lives. Walter split his time between the site and his office, fighting to keep his business from collapsing under the pressure of lawsuits, audits, and dwindling investor confidence. The clinic's opening had earned him a wave of public support, but it hadn't been enough to silence his critics. Darius, meanwhile, took on responsibilities far beyond what anyone expected of a 12-year-old. He greeted patients at the door, helped organize supplies, and even started shadowing the staff, eager to learn everything he could. But his focus always returned to his grandmother, who had become the clinic's first patient. The day she came home from the hospital was one Darius would never forget. She walked through the door on her own, her steps slow but steady. The sight of her upright, no longer confined to bed, brought tears to Darius's eyes. "You look strong," he said, barely able to get the words out. She smiled and reached out to cup his face. "Because of you." For the first time in months, Darius allowed himself to believe that everything they had fought for was worth it. But even as the clinic began to thrive, shadows lingered. Walter's legal troubles worsened. The audits expanded, and several board members resigned, leaving his business vulnerable. His name, once a symbol of power and wealth, had become a cautionary tale about what happened when billionaires tried to play hero. The pressure mounted until one afternoon, Walter's lawyer delivered the news he had been dreading. "They're filing charges," the lawyer said, setting a thick folder on Walter's desk. "Tax evasion, mismanagement of funds, you name it. It's a smear campaign, but it's going to stick unless we fight it." Walter's hands clenched into fists. "Fight it how?" "By shutting down the clinic." The words hung in the air, heavy and suffocating. Walter shook his head. "No. It's the only way to prove you're still focused on your core business," the lawyer insisted. "Walk away, cut your losses, and salvage what you can." Walter rose from his chair and turned to the window, staring out at the city below. The thought of abandoning the clinic felt like a betrayal, not just to Darius, but to himself. "I won't do it," he said quietly. "Then be prepared to lose everything." Darius sensed something was wrong long before Walter said anything. The man had started coming to the clinic less often, his usual calm replaced by a quiet tension that set everyone on edge. Darius finally cornered him in the break room one evening. "You're leaving, aren't you?" Walter froze, caught off guard. "What?" "You're leaving," Darius repeated. "You're going to give up." "No, I'm not," Walter said, but the hesitation in his voice betrayed him. Darius stepped closer. "You promised." Walter looked away. "And I'm keeping that promise. But—" "No buts," Darius's voice cracked, raw with frustration. "You said this mattered. You said you wouldn't let them stop you." Walter flinched. The boy's words cut deep, not because they were unfair, but because they were true. "I'm not giving up," Walter said finally, "but I need time to fix this, to fight them." Darius didn't look convinced. "Then fight," he said, "but don't leave us behind." Walter did fight. He hired a new legal team, cut ties with the board members who had turned against him, and went public with his side of the story. He gave interviews, wrote op-eds, and held press conferences, framing the attacks against him as an attempt to stop real change. And it worked. Slowly, but it worked. Public support grew. Donations to the clinic poured in, and even as Walter's business struggled, the clinic thrived. Months passed, and the clinic became a cornerstone of the community. It offered free checkups, affordable medications, and classes on nutrition and wellness. Darius's grandmother volunteered as a receptionist, welcoming patients with warmth and kindness. Darius, too, found his place. He continued shadowing doctors, learning as much as he could about medicine. Walter even arranged for him to attend weekend science programs at a nearby university, planting the seeds for a future Darius hadn't dared to dream about before. Walter, meanwhile, began rebuilding his company. It wasn't easy, and he had to make sacrifices, but he found a new sense of purpose, one rooted not in profit but in impact. One evening, as Walter and Darius locked up the clinic, Walter turned to the boy. "You ever think about what comes next?" Darius shrugged. "For the clinic? For you?" Darius thought for a moment. "I think I want to be a doctor." Walter smiled. "I think you'd be a damn good one." Darius grinned. "I'll hold you to that." Walter laughed, but there was pride in his eyes. The story didn't end there. There were more challenges, funding shortfalls, political battles, and personal losses. But the clinic stood as a reminder that change wasn't just possible, it was necessary. And at the center of it all were two people who had started as enemies and become something more. Partners, friends, family. As Walter and Darius stood outside the clinic that night, looking up at the glowing sign, they knew one thing for certain. This wasn't the end, it was only the beginning. Thank you for watching this story to the end. If you liked it, support the channel. Subscribe and click on the bell to not miss new episodes. Share this video with your friends and family. Let it inspire them too. Leave a comment where you're watching us from and hop on over to our other stories. See you in the next video.